The chair is in the dumbest position ever. We're standing around a chair. We're like the ferns in between two ferns. Product placement. Look at that. You know what? What we have to order next is the chocolate peanut butter.
Yeah.
That's the one. We just go on chocolate vanilla. And we were talking about this the other day. I kind of I was a bit reluctant on any flavor that wasn't chocolate or vanilla. Like, that's how I grew up. That's like my era of fitness.
It's the. Did you ever make the mistake of doing strawberry in anything?
Yeah, it was a mess. Strawberry routinely was a mess. But they've been working on flavors like it's the cure for cancer. Like other companies, they're just out there, man. I just can't.
Just go simple. Simple,
hey, you
effective.
know what? I remember back in the day, my friends could smoke drugs and not die. And, you could just get chocolate and vanilla protein.
Yeah.
Now I get friends that smoke weed. You can't talk to them for 3 days. Because they've been working on, there's all these different things and strains. True story. We were in a trap house in Brooklyn. Well, technically, I think it was Williamsburg. 3 days ago? And I'm talking legit drug den. And we were there to get drugs.
Yeah.
So we don't full transparency here on RX Radio. We were there to get drugs. And dude, they opened the person. It was 100% the real Cheddar Bob. And the hand was broken too, which I loved. Which is it was everything that I needed Mac to see about a Williamsburg, New York City trap house.
I got the full
when
experience.
He opened up the fucking drawer with the weed.
Yeah.
How many different flavors and fucking strains or whatever they call it?
Pre-rolled, ready to go. The whole thing was full.
It was insane. I remember when buying rolling papers was difficult for my friends. I never got into the weeds. Did you have
Rizzler? Was that what you had?
Is that some South African?
I think
shit?
so.
Explain that. Is that like your fucking, what's your Lucky Pack or whatever the fuck you were trying to explain the other day? Was that bullshit?
Lucky Packet, yeah. I'm sure someone knows what a Lucky Packet is.
Do we have an audience in South Africa? We must.
Shout out Lil. Yeah, Kimball.
Yeah.
Lil Kim. Lucky Packets. If anyone knows what a Lucky Packet is, please DM us.
Yeah, at RX Radio.
Yeah, because it's a thing. It
sounds terrible.
It does sound like drugs,
but it does sound like
everything's
the worst. It does sound like the least worst part about your childhood.
Yes.
If the Lucky Packs was, it only got worse from the Lucky Packs from the violence and the drugs.
Definitely did.
But no, chocolate peanut butter. I had some when I was back home.
Good.
Fucking amazing. Especially when you mix. I like the chocolate peanut butter and mix stuff in. But I'll do the vanilla with the orange Gatorade powder. Have you ever done that trick?
Yeah, so you do 10 grams with training.
The creamsicle one.
Yeah.
That's like the real science behind post-training supplementation is like carb
and intra. So it's intra. It's 10 grams of protein while training. That's where like the leucine and with BCAAs came from. 10 grams while training. So the idea behind that is trying to get 10 grams of protein, which generally would come from either EAAs or leucine or isoleucine from that side. And have that with your carbohydrates while you were training.
Got it.
I think that's a good segue into what we're talking about.
A little bit, yeah. So HD Muscle.
That's it.
HDmuscle.com/
promo code is RX'd
Radio. No, just
RX'd. It's just RX'd for
kicks. These are my smelly gym shoes. These are legit the ones I wear. I like yours though.
Yeah.
The white ones, the white joint, it's all good. Imagine these but white and red.
Yeah.
And this is code RX'd Radio.
Correct. That's RX'd Radio.
So there's vivobarefoot.com/ RX'd Radio.
Yep.
Promo code RX'd.
Yep.
I don't know, something ridiculous off your first purchase. I forget what it is.
20%? Dude, that's huge.
That's the move.
It's like 20%, and they last a long time.
Dude, yeah, we've been beating the shit out of them. We would actually walk into the gym on leg days with them. Game changer.
Yeah.
So paying the bills, HD Muscle, Vivo Barefoot. I want to stay on track with the protein stuff. It's Phil Smith. Phil Smith's nutrition course, we kind of gave him, you know how long it ended up being? I think it was originally marketed as a 12-week course. I think it went to 17 weeks.
Yeah. When we created the programming course, we buffered for something like 4 weeks post, and he still went further than our course. It's definitely close to 16 to 18.
And if you guys are interested in any course that's not currently up for sale, we're giving a 5% discount if you just sign up for the wait list. So if you guys have ever wanted to take a pre-script course, go right now, find the course you want to take, and just putting your name on the email list to notify you gets you 5% off. And it's like, that adds up.
Yeah, it adds up a lot.
Adds up. You can buy a pair of shoes or protein.
Well, you can do protein, shoes, and a course and just become part of the clan.
Nailed it. Clan is probably the wrong word to come from the South African. And this will be our last episode of RX Radio, so do enjoy. Phil Smith. Lundy, hit it.
You're tuned in to RX Radio. So first off, one of the things is obviously the tracking aspect. So that's when we talk about, what the health-seeking behavior is the current sort of trendy, term people are using, and I myself use that term pretty regularly as well.
Can I intervene quickly?
Yeah.
Health-seeking when I hear the words organized like that, what's the first thing that comes to your mind?
Health-seeking behaviors?
Based off of that sentence and tone, what's another thing that sounds very similar to that?
Drug addiction?
Drug-seeking behavior.
Yeah.
That's the first thing that came to mind. It was they're all junkies.
Well, I suppose there's a level of that. So, obviously from the food, we have obviously eating disorder being the extreme case, and then we have what's called disordered eating, which is quite prevalent within the fitness community as well. So one's clinical, one's subclinical. But we also need to look at, it becomes an obsession with, tracking and getting things right. And that's these days is sort of more referred to orthorexia, which is where this obsession with quote unquote clean eating becomes sort of, obsessive, I suppose is the best way to say it, where people are consumed by nutrient density and health, and a lot of it's perception of health. So it's not necessarily what is healthy, but what is perceived healthy. So for example, and that's can be determined by your belief system. So for example, if you're a keto person and you don't mind saturated fats, that's going to be where you go. If you're a broccoli, brown rice and sort of chicken breast sort of type of person, that's where you're going to go. So it all comes back to belief systems. But that ortho sort of prefix has become synonymous with different things. So orthosomnia, for example, is something we talk about in the performance nutrition course. So orthosomnia is obsession with adequate sleep. So one of the things that we look at when we're trying to improve the health of an athlete is what metrics can we measure. And I'm a big advocate for metrics that matter. And if I reference McIntosh for a second, he's the metrics guy, he's the spreadsheet guy, he takes a lot of things. But the difference between him and the general coach who just takes metrics for so he or she can look like the tits, he does things with his metrics to the point where he actually says, all right, listen, your blood pressure is high, so we need to intervene with more cardio or more aerobic training or et cetera, et cetera. Whereas these days it's almost cool to take as many metrics as possible, but if you're not doing anything with it, it becomes a problem. And that orthosomnia is one of those things, whereas if you get an athlete to say, for example, start tracking their sleep, but it's coming into a competition phase, that can potentially cause anxiety and that can cause different things. And it's this anxiousness that comes from all of those ortho type prefixes where you've got orthosomnia, orthorexia, this obsession with consumption of perfect.
Dude, I'm laughing because I've had to live with McIntosh for the last month and a half. And it's hard to be someone who's is insomnia the opposite of orthosomnia?
I'd imagine.
Insomnia is bad sleep, yeah.
Okay, is ins as a prefix the opposite of ortho? I didn't get into the etymology of the words.
Well, orthosomnia is generally an obsession with, so it's an obsession with correct health, with correct sleep. Sorry, so it's not necessarily like insomnia is inadequate sleep. So insomnia just means sleep. So insomnia is just is inadequate sleep or deficiency in sleep. Orthosomnia is an obsession with said sleep.
It's been such an eye opener to me to know McIntosh, and kind of to your point that you're discussing, like metrics that matter. And to just fall victim to understanding everything you're saying, but the second I have to live it, I've had so much more empathy in the last month in living with him, because it's like I'm checking my blood sugar, I'm checking my pulse and my blood pressure every other day, but I'm just like, man, this is a lot. And for someone who doesn't sleep well and is routinely not eating well, it's like, fuck, man. I don't know. That must be, it is crippling if it's disordered, but that insomnia or the insomnia versus orthosomnia, whatever the opposite is for food consumption, not giving a shit to then acutely having to give a shit. I could just imagine how daunting a psychological state it must be to suffer from thinking that that optimal is at the forefront of your belief system.
Yeah, it's massive. And a lot of it comes back to attitudes towards food as well. So you need to sort of look at when you change things, and this is probably a big conversation as well around things like behavior change, and not to sort of go into a tangent, but that's typically where we go, is we need to look at, so every single one of us in this room, probably half of your listeners at least, have heard of Atomic Habits by James Clear. We've all read that book copious amounts of times. Well, it's all based off this BJ Fogg guy. So BJ Fogg he's a professor, I believe, at the University of Toronto, I believe, or maybe maybe McMaster, one of those two anyway. He actually no, I think he's anyway. Long story short, he's a professor somewhere at one of the universities, right? Where's Huberman? Where's he?
Stanford.
He could be at Stanford then. Anyway, the long story short is he created this concept called tiny habits, and he attaches it to this ABC method. So ABC is anchor behavior celebration. So basically what he does is he takes this concept of like having an existing behavior and anchor, creating a new behavior to it, then celebrating the small wins after the fact. And a lot of us try and go in, and you mentioned before about going from 0 to 100. And that's where a lot of the mistakes are made. And that's where things like anxiety and obsession come into play. Whereas if we actually look at it, how we should move forward in these changes, making these small manageable changes over time and creating this exact anchor. And the example I often use with a lot of clients and in my education stuff is if I said to you guys, hey, I want you to have a multivitamin every single morning, but I want you to put that multivitamin in a lockbox in the spare room at the back cupboard. What the chances of you consuming that multivitamin is zero fuck all, right? Because it's too hard to get to. So instead, you say to me, hey, you have a glass of water every single morning. On the kitchen counter next to your empty glass, I want you to put the multivitamin there every night. When you wake up and you fill your glass of water, that becomes the anchor. The behavior is the easy, accessible new multivitamin, which you then take. And then you do a small celebration, whether it's a self high five, whatever the case may be after the fact. You celebrate that consumption. And it's a small, minute change to everything we're trying to achieve. And it comes back to that whole conversation, like, where does the anxiety come from? The anxiety comes from the belief system that the person isn't doing enough or isn't getting it right. So if we come back to those health-seeking behaviors, if we give a person a list of 10 things, it's too much. It creates too much of a behavioral change. You give them one thing, and it could be like, hey, don't choose, in your post-workout, don't choose a bread sauce or a fast-acting carb via the way of a grain. Maybe choose a piece of fruit. Maybe choose a stone fruit, which is low in fructose, higher in glucose. That's going to allow them to hit their fruits and vegetables, or go towards at least hitting their fruits and vegetables, and improve their metrics that way. 93% of the Western world don't hit adequate fruit and vegetables, so let's try and lower that number a little bit more by introducing some pretty simple behaviors we can do that won't necessarily cause stress for that person.
Isn't that just the pretext to learning, though? Isn't that kind of like a Skinner or Pavlovian model? Like the anchor, if it's clear, summarizing the works of this professor, isn't that just, that to me sounds like ring a bell and salivate, right? And get the food. Does not kind of fall. That's what comes to mind when I hear this. It's like, it's just basic learning.
It is, but it's application. That's the biggest change is application. So more of the academic sort of world could sort of look at it and go, yeah, that's the process of learning new tasks each and every time you sit down to a lesson. But the average person has to apply this in their real world, and people aren't thinking about a group of dogs running after a lunch bell, like you might be, for example, right? So how do we put this into play in a realistic fashion? And it's about the smallest, simplest changes, which they won't necessarily notice. If we can maximize the change by minimizing the attention span to that change, or the attention to that change, that's how we're going to move forward.
My biggest thing is, where's the line, right? Where does the line become, like, where does it come from, like, subclinical to clinical to disordered? Like, the idea that undoubtedly in the last 4 weeks in living with Mac, I've been pricking my finger every other morning. He's literally like sitting there, like, making my meals. Is like, what was that? 30 grams of peanut butter. And I'm just like, and it's a habit now. Like, absolutely. He packed me, and I'm not making this up, he packed me 2 boxes of the cereal we've been eating around our workouts and a tub of protein powder in my suitcase before I left for Toronto. And I was just like, okay, like, and undoubtedly I've made body composition changes in the last 5 weeks. But to me, to have that level of rigidity in my life is insane, like an insane change. What are indicators that these health-seeking behaviors or habits are detracting from your overall health? Like, the power of belief is so strong. If you believe that it is it always?
No, it's when you start looking at things that you, in my opinion, because a lot of the times, that's when we move into the psychological aspect, and we have to sort of, people in my shoes have to refer out. So we refer out to psychologists and sort of eating disorder specialized dietitians and things like that. So RDs in the US and APDs here in Australia. But the recognition from coaches and nutritionists alike can come from certain conversations with your clients. So things like, for example, social avoidance or environmental avoidance, situational avoidance. So when they're starting to sort of withdraw from certain things in order to avoid being put in front of things, that's one of the things that can occur. It's panic and obvious behavior change around certain foods. So, for example, are they withholding from consumption based on something they had, earlier in the day, for example? So does that create stress and anxiety for the person? So if a person, one of my general advice pieces with clients is don't have a decadent breakfast. And although there's nothing wrong with pancakes and waffles for breakfast, we can go nuts if that's your thing. But it does leave you chasing your tail for the rest of the day. It also creates potential to create this anxiety moving forward through the day as well, because you consume a very large portion of your carbs and fats for the, in the first half of the day. And then you're having to make up this bullshit style meal of a protein shake and and something airy fairy for the rest of the day. And you end up just being hungry for the rest of the day. And that creates a binge restrict cycle as well.
Yeah.
So there's those sorts of things. So if you're a person who, for example, has a more calorically dense decadent meal on a Monday night, and then you try and forego food Tuesday or half of Tuesday in order to make up the calories, quotations there, of course. So that's the behavior you have to recognize, or you have to have people around you who recognize, and that's when that referral goes out.
I've seen a lot of people forming behaviors like that around macro counting in general. Is they get so obsessive over it that they have to hit their macros, that they're probably stressing to a point that's unhealthy about hitting those macros to actually establish that goal, and probably eating foods that aren't the best for them along the way too.
Yeah, and this is where I have real issues with it used to be called If It Fits Macros, now it's called flexible dieting.
Right.
This is where I do get a little bit agitated, is probably a nice way to say it, by people who push that style of eating 100%, is because there are people who do it properly. And I'll reference like someone like Dr. Lane Norton, for example. He talks about flexible dieting and the benefits of it. And by all means, the way he speaks of it is absolutely true. You can eat the 80-20 rule, the 90-10 rule, for example, and you can have chicken, broccoli, and brown rice and a range of different foods involved in your meals. And then you can leave and allow waffles and pancakes if you wish. But it's the people who live on protein pancakes and sugar-free maple syrup and shit like that, where there's a lot of calorically dense food going in, but very nutrient-sparse food going in. And the reference I always use is you're giving a Ferrari full of fuel with no key to start the engine, right? We're giving very, very high energy foods, but we have to remember the minerals and vitamins in our nutrition is the catalyst and the enzyme function that actually occurs that allows this energy to be utilized correctly. So that's a big thing you need to look at, so that if it fits your macros or flexible dieting, there is a lot of that tail chasing, as you said, Jordan. So that's one of the things you need to sort of concern yourself with as well.
Yeah, there's nothing like a macro math before bed meal, right? Like just like you're throwing together. I've seen two people in a room, one person trying to fit their macros within a final meal of the day, and the other person completely stoned out of their mind on edibles, and they both made the exact same food. Yeah. One person was sitting there with like a scale and weighing it out. The other person just got like, I don't know, peanut butter and like 7 blueberries and like a granola bar for the thing, and then they both had the same macronutrients. It's just like that last minute. It's literally like a Hail Mary play in gridiron football, where it's just like, there's 2 minutes left on the clock. You're so far behind, and you just throw it to the backfield with like, you're just putting stuff together, and you're using, protein powder as a condiment. You're like, what the fuck are you doing? Like that can't be useful. Like that has to be at a certain point detrimental.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I'd love to hear your opinion on this, Phil, but I think macro tracking is a good way to learn like portion control and the amounts of each macronutrient that you should be eating throughout the day, so that you know how you should feel with your meals and things like that. But it's just not like it by definition kind of disorders your eating, right? It forces you to eat a certain way or think about your meals in a certain way that's a little bit disorderly.
I mean, I would put it as reorder and then disorder.
Right, to some extent, yeah.
I'm in two minds about this, because a big part of me wants to go into a rant about this whole movement around things like intuitive eating is one of the things that irritates me at the moment, because like we've talked about before, both privately and on air, is social media doesn't allow doesn't allow you to discern between, context, for example, right? So these days it's getting better because long form videos at work, etc. But everyone's pushing this intuitive eating conversation at the moment, and unfortunately, you're putting out a message that is telling people just to eat how they feel. And if you haven't got the prerequisite information or knowledge behind you in order to do that, you're gonna eat fucking Macca's at KFC for the rest of your life. You guys have Mickey D's is what you guys call it.
I believe the Canadianism, now that we're in Toronto, as I've learned, is McDick's.
McDick's. I just learned that too.
Canadianism. Mickey D's would be the American, and
correct.
Macca's, the affectionately named Australia. Which Australians, you call Rice Krispies rice bubbles, so I don't think you guys get a vote.
How cute.
So dumb. So dumb. When him just saying the word bubbles being fucking the biggest person I know.
So delicate.
The point is the same, is that we end up having this free-for-all around our food, and that's where I think we have to have this education system coming in a lot easier, because you can create this big tangent of people who believe they're doing the right thing. And by pushing this intuitive eating conversation, you must go, hey, listen, do you have the underlying knowledge base to move forward in that skill set in order to, as you said, Jiunta, eyeball your food and see your food and know that a palm-sized piece of steak, depending on your palm, is X amount of protein approximately. Do you know that the leanest cut of lamb is fattier than the fattiest cut of beef? Do you know that? Or are you tracking? And just because you track, and that goes into segue into the next point, just because you track, are you tracking the right thing? One of the things I've heard clients say to me multiple times is, oh, I ate like shit, so I didn't want to track it. But you still fucking ate it. Like, what goes in your tracking journal doesn't mean it doesn't go into your system, right? So understanding that aspect of it is one of the things you need to look at too. And if you're tracking, let's say, lamb, and you're just picking the best option or the leanest option in the field of data points that MyFitnessPal or whatever application you're giving, if you're choosing that just to choose it because it's the leanest option, that doesn't mean that correlates to the piece of lamb that's on your plate. So choose the one which is accordingly. And without that understanding of knowing that, you can't then do it correctly. So intuitive eating is a skill. Macronutrient tracking is a skill. And it has to be learned over time in order to eyeball. And I've never seen anyone like it, but Shay spent years, Shay's my partner for those listening at home, she spent years for training, doing flexible dieting, and she can look at a piece of meat and tell you the macros, the fat, the content, and it's within 5 grams.
Wow. Yeah.
It's
an education is what it is. You have to learn what the composition of foods that you're wanting to eat is and the macronutrients of that.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. And do you know the difference between a rump steak and a sirloin steak? Do you understand that
I only eat ribeyes, so I don't need to know.
I just feel like across the board, human beings' intuition is so muted. We're so far away from intuition. Like, I'm sure there was a point in some Liver King dynasty long ago, before processing of food and readily accessible or readily available food, readily accessible food, where I'm sure there was a time in human history, and maybe it was just auto-regulated by the availability of food or the difficulty to acquire food, that an intuition may have been more correct. But it's like, I watched a guy walk into a tree the other day on his cell phone. It's like, there's no intuition left, right? So it's just to trust that intuition. It's like intuition is it's a skill. It's a learned either through nature or nurture, and we're so far from the nature part of it being passed on. Like, my parents are hobbits, right? I was an outlier at 15 years old at my table because I wasn't drinking Pepsi with my dinner. I switched cold turkey to water. Yeah. Because I learned from people you drink whole sugar Pepsi, and my parents artificial sweeteners are bad. I was I'm pre-diabetic at 15. This is insane. But it's just the intuitive eating thing. And on the flip side of that too, the people who lie to themselves when they track the leanest cut of lamb and they're actually eating the fattiest cut of lamb. I mean, I sympathize with that. I drank as a kid and I stopped drinking at 18 before Huberman said it was bad. When I used to drink, I almost did what these tracking people did. Well, I'm drunk, it doesn't count. Well, I didn't track it, it doesn't count.
Yeah.
So there's a few things there as well. Also understanding, a lot of the times you got to remember is people aren't tracking their fatty cuts of lamb because they're deliberately sort of trying to be, sort of mischievous or sort of, deceitful. A lot of it's just education. They just don't understand the differences. They don't understand that difference. But also going on to the understanding portion of it as well, do they understand what phase they're in as well? So one of the things I sort of talk about a lot is this misunderstanding of the word anabolic. Anabolic is one of the things that we talk about, and in our meathead style world, we reference it to muscle growth. In actual fact, it's just cell replication, it's just cell growth. So with that in mind, in a, let's say, post-competition, so physique competitions, for example, or a post-dieting phase, photo shoot, whatever the case may be, even like a long duration cut for a powerlifting comp, people become more anabolic in that post-show window. But somewhere in the bro science world, we've associated that high anabolism after a show to meaning that we're primed, quote unquote, to build muscle. We're not at all. We're primed to build body fat. And it's this hibernation effect. I call it the hibernation effect because a bear comes out of hibernation. What's its brain telling it to do? Eat. Right? It's telling it to eat. Well, dieting is voluntary famine. That's what it is. It's famine we've done voluntarily. And especially to the extent of a bodybuilding show or some sort of long-term dieting phase. So when we come out of those windows and that temporal landmark of the show or the competition, whatever the case may be, has passed, we're left with this free-for-all. And our brain has this sort of ability to change what our perception is, and it elevates hunger and it elevates everything. And after a sustained period of dieting, our ghrelin and our different hormone responses elevate and can stay elevated for up to a year after. So if you're coming out of that window and you haven't actually prepared or had education that's allowed you to gain that knowledge, you're going to just eat. And it's not on you. It's not your fault. It's your body's telling you to do this subconsciously or unconsciously, I should say. So it's telling you to go and eat. So your perception of meal size and portion size is much larger or much different to what it was previously. So having that knowledge to know that stuff is very different to not having it and trying to be actively deceitful.
I mean, in the interest of being proactive with these types of things, like, what is the line that you draw from like a metrics perspective? Like, I push. Are you an Apple Watch guy? You're not an Apple Watch guy. Are you an Apple Watch guy? I feel like you're an Apple Watch guy. Okay, but even that, like, the attachment thing, the symbiosis of the machine and me being a cog of it, like, are you wary, or maybe it's a case-by-case basis, like, are you wary about certain athletes or certain clients with accessibility to metrics and statistics? Like, different applications or different wearables have a different ease in interpreting and accessing your data, right? Like the Whoop is a different example because you can't pull it up right there and then. Right, the Apple Watch, you can go right on your phone. This is something that I've thought about. Is like, people are like, oh, you should get an Apple Watch. It's like, I don't need access to that information, right? Because I think that would be bad. Are you ever hesitant about like thinking about when prescribing metrics, the ease of method of tracking some of these things around sort of that psychosis that can be developed as a byproduct, like something that, if something were to buzz on my wrist and tell me to get up, I think I'd smash it immediately. Like, oh, you've been sitting for a long time. It's like, yeah, I have a job, asshole. There goes the Apple Watch.
I wake up to the Whoop. The Whoop buzzes to wake me up in the morning. That's how it's my alarm clock now. It just vibrates and wakes me up. So I don't have an alarm going off on my phone anymore. It just my Whoop. And
you enjoy that?
Well, it's much easier. It doesn't create that alert response like an alarm clock does. So it just lightly vibrates. So that cortisol spike that I would normally get when the alarm clock doesn't go off. That's one of the reasons I bought the Whoop is for sleep, because I have pretty average sleep. But to go back to your original question, it's a weird tangent. But I changed the metrics, and I don't have a standard set of metrics because metrics differ the importance level for each person. So if you're taking, for example, blood pressure or glucose response, for example, or glucose numbers, is that going to create a belief system within a person? And if we go back to the wearables do things like create recovery responses. And the Whoop's a really good example. It gives you recovery, but it's based off your HRV. Your HRV on a peripheral worn device, so a wrist worn device versus a central worn device, is going to be quite varied, and it's not going to be very accurate. It's going to be sort of ballparkish, but not necessarily over the toply accurate. So you need to sort of have that discussion before somebody walks into your room, or at the very least when you first start with them, and say, listen, hey, if your Apple Watch is telling you you're burning 1,200 calories before 6 a.m. on a Monday morning, chances are it's fucking wrong, right? So otherwise we'd all be shredded all the time. So understanding that those calorie counts on those worn devices are things like intensity gauges. They're just telling you how intensely you trained. Also, as well, I had a conversation with a guy on Saturday morning about this. He was talking about his Whoop told him he was under recovered, so he gave his session a miss that day. How'd you feel? Because I felt good, but my Whoop said I was under recovered. Well, don't skip your session because you felt fine, but your wearable told you weren't. Like that's silly, right? There's a bridge you've got to sort of draw, or a line to stand you've got to draw. So listen, hey, if you feel okay, but your wearable is telling you something different, assess how you feel internally. Don't rely on technology for that. Same as if you feel like shit, but your wearable is telling you that you feel amazing, maybe take that into account as well. Maybe go for a light walk instead. When it comes to things like actual internal metrics, like blood pressure, as I said before, I'm very skeptical about using blood pressure for a lot of people. I may go and get them to do it periodically, but unless there's a need to know it, for example, if there's a person who, they say, in off season, for example, has put a lot of weight on their off season and we're trying to improve their preseason sort of performance, I might take blood pressure more regularly. But if they're a sort of athletically minded individual as opposed to being an athlete, which is one sits between that gen pop and that athletic individual, I would definitely sort of be skeptical about using too many metrics unless I was going to apply the outcomes or apply changes to improve or change those metrics.
So you're looking for like more direct, like causal inferences rather than just potentially correlative.
Yeah, that's right. Absolutely. So if go back to the blood pressure, for example. So I would, if someone had a really high blood pressure, I would either do it myself, depending on how I'm coaching the individual, or talk to their coach about maybe improving their aerobic capacity and doing it through, more steady state based cardio as opposed to, high intensity type stuff. So if we can talk amongst the coaches, or if I'm doing it myself with the client, I can move forward in a certain way based on what the outcome is, based on what the results of that test is.
What have been some of the more like pervasive trends in your mind when it comes to data collection, or like even like the frontier of data collection? What are things that are coming or are relatively new that you're like, this is a problem?
I think HRV is widely misunderstood. I think people don't quite understand what HRV is. It's a stress response. So it's how well you're adapted to change when it comes to stress. And a lot of people tend to think that a sudden plummet in HRV is the world's going to end and they need to stop what they're doing. And it's not the case at all. You just need to adapt and change and make modifications that way as well. I'll be honest, I'll go back to the whole, when it comes back to something like physique athletes in the later portions of physique, and this is not really on the cusp, but this is just more of an observation I've made over years. Coming close to a competition, people get obsessed with their body fat percentage and they want to get DEXs all the time. No judge is looking at you on stage going, hey, he or she looks great. Oh, but she's 9% body fat. She should be 7. Like, that's not ever happening. It's a subjective sport. So creating some sort of conversation or open discourse where you can discuss what actually is the important part of their health is a big one as well. I think people are... Sorry, go ahead.
No, I'm laughing because bodybuilders have such a tendency to miss that. Like, I think of a useless metric in bodybuilding. Obviously, that's like really on par or in line with what we're talking about. But there's no more useless metric in bodybuilding to me than the strength that you have.
Yeah.
Like, they just love collecting shit that doesn't matter. So it's like, well, she's 7 and she's 9. Yeah, but, she lifts 6 plates per side on the hack squat, reverse bend.
Yeah.
It's like, stop doing shit that doesn't matter.
It doesn't matter. Also, as well, I think there's a big use of pathology with athletes these days from people who don't know how to read pathology properly. They can, they look at the number, then they look at the reference range to the right-hand side and they go, oh, you're within range. Okay, but how does that, that range may be within range, but is there something else correlating to something else in the test that may be causing a change? So that's, for example, are you macrocytic? If someone goes, hey, your iron or your ferritin is out, do they then turn really quickly and look at how big their MCV, how high or how low their MCV is? Mean cell volume. So, for example, mean corpuscle volume. So, changing the size of the blood cell itself. So, looking at that sort of stuff and understanding, is there a correlation there? If they have high glucose, to then look at triglycerides to make sure they're okay. So therefore there's no, insulin resistance or something like that. Like having all those conversations where just because something's in range doesn't necessarily mean it doesn't cause or have a downstream effect on something else. So a lot of people are talking about bloods, but don't know how to use it in relation to other bloods.
Yeah, it's the tensegrity model of blood work is something that I think most people understand what tensegrity model is, maybe even just in practice with training. And my shoulder hurts and then my back, I strained my SI joint. It's like maybe these two things are related. No one would think that, we're just going to like treat the SI joint without addressing the underlying potential shoulder issue. People kind of are getting to the point where they can grasp that tensegrity of I'm going to move something over here and something over here is going to adjust. But bloods does seem very like, that we're just going to turn this volume up or we're going to turn this volume down.
Yeah. Also, as well, it's something that I know you've had a recent conversation, Shallow, as well, is around IgG testing, food tolerance testing.
Oh, God.
Garbage.
Make it stop. Yeah, well, there's two, right? Like there's one that will, one is genetic based, which I find that premise almost as laughable. I mean, it's a race to the bottom as just one is like a food allergy thing. It's just like, I don't know if anything I'm sending in the mail that I spit in is going to give me anything useful as far as, I'm 78% Scandinavian, you're a Libra, and also, maybe eat sourdough bread. It's like, what the fuck kind of mood ring is this that we're basing our nutrition habits on?
Well, the biggest one that I always point out is whenever someone says, I got an IgG test done, it's always like, I better come up with the food you eat all the time. Because, how'd you know that? Because it always does. Because an IgG response is exactly the body's natural immune response to the food you consume. So that's why it's horseshit. And it's always, you meet these people in the fitness industry, it's always like chicken, broccoli, eggs, salmon, and steak, or something along those lines. Whatever they consume very frequently, because the immunoglobulin G response is an immediate response, or a delayed response, I should say, over 3 to 5 days to food you eat on the regular. So you've got all these people doing these tests, and they're having to sort of like, as I go back to the whole concoction of a weird meal, because they can't have all of these foods because they've got high responses to them. No, you just eat them a lot. So there's a natural elevation in the body's response to consuming those particular amino acid blends. That's the reason why it happens. So it's a ridiculous statement to say that there's any validity to those.
I mean, it kind of reminds me of two things. One, it reminds me of a stupid mood ring, and it reminds me of horoscopes, to which if anyone addresses me on those, I'll just stop talking to them in the middle of the sentence. But it also kind of comes down, it reminds me of endo versus ecto versus mesomorph, like that morphology categorization.
Somatotypes sort of stuff.
Yeah, somatotypes. And like I paid that a little mind at its peak because I don't know, I was maybe 16 years old. But like, is anything like that? I haven't seen that surface. I haven't heard people pull that card. Oh, I'm such a mesomorph, or I'm such a Libra, or I'm such a whatever. Like, is that still pervasive? Like, do people still hang their hat on that morphology?
Yeah, like it still comes up. It still comes up. Someone will say, and the difficulty with that is we've all got a person we know who is, bee's dick skinny, eats all the fucking food in the world and just can't put weight on. We know that person. But what we don't talk, and like, so a lot of people will bring up, he's full ecto, and look, I don't want to say I say it, that's a horrible thing to admit, but it's more, I'll say he's got those tendencies or she's got those tendencies. But what we're actually forgetting is that when we actually increase somebody's intake of nutrition or caloric intake, a lot of the times their NEAT goes up. It could be things like unconscious NEAT. So NEAT obviously is non-exercise activity thermogenesis for those playing at home. And it's more just like how much we fidget or move or have sort of increased torque. And, an example would be, and this is I'll veer off and come back if that makes sense, right? So when you're in low energy state and you're going to the supermarket and you're going to the supermarket and you're trying to find a car park, your body will look for a car park. And it's going to try and you'll start to negotiate internally with yourself. You say, I'm going to find a car park. Oh, there's a car park. Oh, no, it's too far away. I'll find one closer. And it's going to find a close car park. When you're in a high energy state, you're going to find a car park and park there and walk inside the supermarket. Now, in both cases, from a conscious point of view, your body is just finding a car park consciously. But it's your willingness to accept one that's either close or far away, dependent on your internal energy state and how your brain perceives your energy ability to actually to make that journey or to conserve energy. The same goes into things like like you can see I'm talking with my hands a lot now, hanging out with Shay too much. She's a Sicilian. So like all of these different things are things to consider. But they've done metabolic reward studies where people blink slower in low energy states. They chew slower. They speak slower. They fidget less. They start talking in a really monotone voice with their hands nice and still. All of these things are things that they've measured in low energy states. So in high energy states, people will fidget more, talk more, and their natural movement or unconscious movement will go up. So what they've actually done is they found that when you give a group of individuals 1,000 calories over their maintenance, on average, out of that 1,000 calories, only 364 calories goes towards fat mass. The other 636 calories goes towards increased NEAT. That's on average. Now, out of that spectrum of participants within that study, the highest person had 950 odd calories go towards increased NEAT and only 40 or 50 calories go towards fat mass. On the lower spectrum was like 60 calories towards increased NEAT and 940 calories towards fat mass. Okay. Now that is dependent wholly and solely on your previous physical activity level. So if you have a person who's very active, he or she is more likely to get a higher amount of NEAT output than a lower amount of fat mass. A person who's historically sedentary is going to get a lower amount of physical activity level increase and a higher amount of potential fat mass. So that is where the ecto, endo, meso comes from. And the mesos, well, they're just pricks, to be honest. They just get muscle for no reason, and they just have a higher propensity for muscle mass. And we all know those people too, right? And we look at them every year in September on the Olympia stage. They just have a higher propensity for fat mass, and that is genetic. So we can't get away from that. That exists.
So they're really just landmarks of intersecting hormonal activity and genetic predispositions. That's all they really are. They're not like, and everyone exists on a spectrum. We've just decided to highlight these particular intersections that probably, like, I think of it as like a roulette wheel, where it's, this the same presence of, I don't know, I haven't gambled in a while, but like someone will see like a 00 and it's like, man, what are the odds? Like the exact same as the rest of them on the wheel, but it's green and it's there, but it's like, yeah, but it's the same fucking thing. It's black 17 or red 21 or whatever. Like it's the same odds. So like you could come up with it's almost like Pokemon. Have you seen what they've done with Pokemon lately?
No.
Insane. There's like 1,000 of them. I was out at 150. I could do Pokemon Blue. Give me an hour and a half. Done. No problem. But now it's like there's so many of them, and it's almost like every permutation of make-believe Japanese creature now has a name to it. We could do that with humans, right? But we kind of hang our hats on these three kind of beacons of intersections that are equally as random as just some jackass walking down the street. Like, oh, that's a Steve-omorph. It's like, why? Because that's Steve, and that's what he looks like, and that's just his representation of that intersection of habits and behaviors and training and nutrition and genetics and hormones and so on. I find it very.
Well, first I was going to say this is firstly Pokemon. What the fuck,
dude? Come on. All right. Hey, first off, blames Shay for the fidginess. Down the monster into the Star Wars Cup I got Shay's back as a fellow chiropractor. Not Shay's fault.
It's actually a Top Gun. It's a Top Gun type.
Yo, how sick was that movie, though? I'm fired up, man. I'm Maverick right now. I watched it on a plane on the way here. Watching Top Gun on a plane is the best. You just want to tell the pilot to floor it.
But yeah, so it goes back to, remember the old Poliquin phases? Remember the phases? He's talking about phases and...
Oh, yeah.
3 phases to change. Well, that's his set point, right? So we all know that there's some things that science can't explain. One of those things is body set point or weight set point. So we have this ability for our body to return to a sort of reference range. But all it comes back to this historical behavior we're just talking about, right? So what's your history like? What's your habits, formations, behaviors, activity, intake, all of these things, and that leads us to create this set point. But internally, we do have this production of this homeostatic principle of sort of different enzyme manufactures, different sort of metabolic activity that exists within our body. And, not to hang my hat on what Poliquin said by any means, but he does talk about this whole like 2 to 3 phase consistent changes in order to change your set point. In reality, what he's doing is creating this concept of time that is on a macro scale, but on a micro scale, it's habitual formation change is what it is. So he's saying, well, you have to actively change your phase for a period of time, which means you have to say you want to lose weight and stop being a quote unquote endomorph to being an ectomorph or something of the like. You have to go through this process of change, which means the dieting phase and then some sort of activity to maintain that loss for 2 or 3 phases. He's really just Poliquinizing the idea of behavior change. So all of this stuff is the same thing, just said in different ways, but we tend to sort of, attach ourselves to these different belief systems. But if you look at it, like most things, nothing works in isolation, everything works in unison, right? How much of it is metabolic? How much of it is behavior? How much of it is habit? All of these different things. And I do reference behavior and habit as 2 different things. We do like to put them interchangeably, but they are 2 different things. One is a conscious movement based on your situation and environment. One is an unconscious movement that came from autonomous behavior, autonomous concepts of behavior. So that's the difference between the 2 habits and behaviors. And I do like to point that out because people like to talk about, that's a habit of mine. No, that's a behavior of yours. It's different. And the behavior is conscious. So creating these conscious changes all the time leads us to this phase change, if I use that same Poliquin concept. And then maintaining it can take either less or more work based on your history of intake, behaviors, activity, and relevance.
Do you feel like constructions of belief systems like that are premeditated? Because, CrossFit, for example, like the community aspect is what really sustained the brand and built it to be one of like the fastest growing fitness brands in the world. The Orange Theories, the F45s, like the very successful fitness companies seem to get what the majority of like nerdy Lincoln bio online coaches don't get. That, the community, the enjoyment, the fact that people just want to work hard or feel like they worked hard. And it's, I always question whether or not this is someone who's very, very smart, thinking about a business plan and going like, what do people actually want in exercise, right? And then consciously constructing this environment that fosters this belief system that brings these people to the table. Like Poliquin, for example, because, it's so easy to look at these constructed belief systems in a vacuum and see where they fall outside of like the more nuanced principles of whether it's nutrition or training. Like we could obviously sit and go through like Orange Theory programs and be like, what the hell is this? But they're getting people in the door, they're getting people moving, and they're really tapping into that belief system being so powerful. Like, do you see the propagation of like nutritional belief systems as like a net positive or negative? Like the fact that people are just being more mindful because they are buying into a belief system. Like obviously Poliquin had his influence. Do you see something like that as premeditated or just sort of a natural occurrence, or on the flip side of that, do you see that belief system being something that's ultimately useful, even if it's not 100% efficient?
I think there's extremes in both cases, to be honest. I think a lot of it being a net positive is a good thing because, like I said, the one thing is people being aware of what they're consuming. That's one of the big things. But if someone has a certain perception of norm or an attitude towards something, it does take those changes over time to make the differences. And there are that zealotry mindset where people are locked into their dogma is one thing you do have to, it's like pushing shit uphill sometimes, but introducing small changes and, having, I think as overall it's a good thing. And I'm just trying to think about what's the best way to say this. The best way to say it is overall it's a good thing because people are more aware of what they're consuming. That is a consciousness. I think some people do go about it the wrong way, but if we can start or even continue in some cases, putting good information out and making sure that we're not always just spending our time calling out people for no reason. That is, and I'm sorry to go back to social media, but I think it's one of the biggest culprits of this, is we live in this world where, this person's wrong, that person's an idiot, et cetera. And all it does is draw attention to those concepts. Whereas, who says, is it you who says the solution to a bad idea is a better idea?
I'm sure a smarter person said it, but I ripped them off and didn't give them any credit. I say that a lot.
Okay, so that's a really good way. And like my personal version of that is I always say attack the subject, not the person. and always come out and point out better versions of things. So if we're coming out, and let's use keto as an example, it's low-hanging fruit, and I've attacked this before on your podcast, so I'm not going to do it again. But it's a simple, easy thing to sort of shit on because their belief systems are flawed. But the concepts are good. The concepts of mainly whole foods, avoiding certain sort of ingredients, maybe, a misunderstanding of how, bioenergetics works, but that's a different conversation. So like you need to go, all right, how do we actually approach this in a better way? How do we give people more information to make sure that they're still hitting their health markers whilst taking this concept? So putting out better information against people who are already interested in nutrition or already interested in improving themselves is the key thing. So as a whole, I know I haven't really answered your question as a direct method, but I'm trying to get to it. Approaching it with the mindset that their intention is good, but there's still a door that hasn't been opened yet. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah. The intention and outcome is always a difficult conversation, right? Like, do intentions matter if the outcome is positive or negative? Like, donating money to charity because I feel good doing it. Well, if I'm not doing it for the intention of helping other people, but other people are still getting helped, the intention outcome axis is always difficult, right? So it's like, if the intention of keto is good, but the outcomes when applied, like I think of starting strength is like a classic example. The intention might be good, but if the outcome is a bunch of people drinking a gallon of milk a day, it's like I have an issue with the outcome, right? And being clear in your messaging can be difficult. And I don't think like you're not at all you're not at all at fault to be reverting back to social media, because if we understand that belief system is such a cornerstone to nutritional habits, it is the number one purveyor of reinforcing or demonizing belief systems, right? The inundation of people's opinions on these belief systems is 24/7. It's like a CNN news cycle. It's just interesting, the outcome intention thing, because you can lose that really easy if the outcome is negative, even in a single case. Oh, so-and-so went keto and he's, look at him now. He's got some sort of metabolic disorder and he's diabetic and he didn't even or whatever. So it is difficult. And I definitely think in nutrition of all cases, because so much of what we're dealing in, or a larger part of what we're dealing in, is so internal and not on the surface, right? In weight training and strength training and physique development, there's a certain level of objectivity. Bodybuilding is a subjective sport, where it's just like health is such it is such an internal thing. And it's, it's not like, big is beautiful and some of the magazines are really running away with this. And someone's like, no, that's probably bad. Like that person is like, 100 pounds overweight. It's just, in nutrition, all people have is their beliefs. Not all, but like there's more beliefs in nutritional systems about, whether it's keto, whether it's paleo, than in training. It's like, I don't know, like you pick stuff up, it's heavy, it's good, but it's like, abstaining from a macronutrient could have crazy outcomes on things beneath the surface, even though it might change one indicator of like body composition, right? Health is so multifaceted. Nutrition's role in health, right? Like you can build the Ferrari, but on the inside you're running it off of toothpaste or whatever. It's like most people with training anyways, they look at it and go, well, I'm just after the Ferrari. I just needed to sit in the driveway. I don't need the performance aspect of it. So it's hard, because that social media landscape really lends itself to calling out the outcomes rather than the intentions.
Yeah, also like with the beliefs, there's also the secondary portion of that is perceptions of norm. So what does a person perceive to be normal in their lifestyle as well? So an example, and I've got a fair few clients in North America, and just finding, getting through the marketing jargon and the belief systems and the perceptions of normal, what they consume. So an example would be like sliced turkey. If you buy sliced turkey from the deli here in Australia, you can guarantee it's literally turkey breast that someone's put a knife to and sliced it. Okay, but in the US, the regulations around binder and different aspects of creating particleized chicken or turkey, for example, that are not the same as they are here in Australia. So you can find, pure turkey breast that's been sliced in the deli, which is 87% turkey. It makes absolutely no sense. So, yeah, look at your faces, right?
It's just a Sex Panther. Sex Panther. 60% of the time. It works every time.
You know, yeah, so that's some of the little limitations you have to sort of be aware of with their belief, and this is where the COM-B method comes into play. So capability, opportunity, motivation equals behavior change. And I know I keep going back to this behavior, but that's the whole premise of this conversation. Is like, how do we make these changes? How do we get this health-seeking behavior to be applicable? But not going to the point of extreme. It's like, all right, well, do they have the capability to do so? Do they have the ability to cook food, for example? So, you know, is there a choice around their nutrition, whether it be a stylized nutrition practice like keto, for example, like carnivore, or is it just their convenience based? Is that one of the things they're doing? They're choosing convenience based food. So is the capability for them to access the change you want to do, or access the sort of food you're trying to prescribe, even available to them? Is the opportunity there as well? And they are different. So capability means, for example, can someone actually cook in the first place? Opportunity means, do they have access to those things as well? Opportunity also relates to things like, for example, the cultural applications. So, for example, like an Italian being very pasta orientated, maybe, for example, like an Islamic family asking a young Islamic male to cook for himself may not be necessarily, you know, culturally appropriate for them, because obviously the females do a lot of cooking in that family. Little things like that are things we need to look at as well. And then motivation. So also, how motivated is that motivation devised down to an easy ability or a hard ability? And is the motivation high or low? Well, where that falls on what's called the trigger line is going to actually, if it falls above the trigger line, it will be done. If it falls below the trigger line, it won't be done. So understanding all of these different complications around this health-seeking behavior, whether it goes to the extreme or stays within the normal range, and the perception of norm versus actual belief systems, are going to culminate in a change or a not change in order to move that person past their current belief system.
It's funny to me to see like the underpinning psychological, sociological assessment that almost supersedes other assessment markers. Like, you know, bloods are obviously could be a part of an intensive assessment protocol for nutritional intervention, but you know, you apologize to going back to the thing that matters most, which is the behavior change side of things. But when it comes to nutritional intervention and nutritional coaching, that's really that's the assessment piece that's hard to teach, and a lot of people don't even understand some of the basic tools or frameworks by which to assess, right? And I mean, this conversation started off as, you know, what do you think is too far? And, you know, obviously, like most things contextual, it always comes back to, well, it depends, right? And having things that it depends on, like that. So it was COM-B, right? So you said capabilities, opportunity, motivation, and then leads to behavior, right? Did I get that? Okay. Yeah, so for me, it's something that's never, and the art is always a word that comes around in coaching, right? And like the art is the people side, but there is a science to managing people, right? There are social sciences, and I just think it's something that, you know, to track, to not to track, blood glucose monitor, continuous, prick your finger, blood pressure, all that. It's, you know, it's really like, it's not a zone. It's like you're playing the man, which I find like super interesting, and it's not a conversation that's had very often, I don't think.
Yeah, I've had a couple of conversations weirdly in the last couple of weeks about this stuff. So I had one lady who was saying to me that she doesn't get fuel anymore. She doesn't get fuel for her car anymore, because when you go into a service station or a gas station, in your language, where you walk in, there's always chocolate or candy in front of the counter, and that was her trigger. So she gets her husband to go put fuel in her car now. So little things like that, she recognized that, again, going back to habits versus behavior, that's a behavior. So it's not necessarily she's doing it unconsciously. She's consciously buying the chocolate, but our behaviors are based on the environment and situation we're in. So can we limit those environments, the decision-making process within those environments, which are going to influence our behaviors? So if this lady, for example, goes to a service station to put fuel in her car, and then, you know, is then triggered internally to buy a chocolate bar or to buy a candy bar, that's going to change the way her results come to her. So whether or not they either come or don't come, for example, right? Very similar. I had another young lady who was going to a service station, and here in Australia, they often have like a McDonald's attached to a service station, for example. So they're attached to the side of them. So she was finishing work at 2 a.m. She was going to the service station. She lived an hour away from her work. She would go via McDonald's at the service station. And I'd say, have you ever thought about going to a different service station? And she was like, oh, shit. that's a good idea. She'd never associate that because the behavior based on the environment she was in at service station prompted her to buy a hamburger or a Coke or whatever the case may be. So little things like that. Is the client even aware of that behavior? Are they aware of that decision-making process based on their environment and the situation as well? The old saying, like, he or she is a bad influence on you. Well, that's a behavior. Because that person, that situation, that environment influences your decision-making process. And, that creates conversation, like you said, managing the person and identifying some of these things as a third party to the actual direct situation can influence how a person makes the decision to or from the behavior change.
Yeah, I think that becomes such a cornerstone to coaching that I've oftentimes, especially now, is really beat out of people in this outcome-based, science-driven, call-out culture. It's like, no matter how much your job depends on you being in the nutrition business or being in the research business or the academia business, we're all in the people business, right? Which I think so easily gets lost. And what gets lost on the outcome is results, is better health, is better longevity or performance or body composition, whatever the goal is. So it's good to be able to create frameworks, because I feel like people get drawn to nutrition from its binary nature. People that coach nutrition are very analytical. They're good at tracking this palm versus thumb versus whatever, 4 fingers the size of your toes. I'm not good at tracking stuff, but they're very analytical in nature. But forced to be good at it, they actually have to be more empathetic, more understanding of like the human side. Because I do feel like more often than not, when we talk about like bodybuilding coaching, it's all feel. Right, it's all feel. They go off that emotional side that makes them feel good. And with training, as we see, you try real hard and you take enough drugs. That stuff kind of sorts itself out. But on the nutritional side, it doesn't seem as if you're going to fall as easily ass backwards into results like you might with training. And there are habits that you can establish that are detrimental. And people try and out-science their way out of things that are so simple when you look at them through a behavioral lens. It's just most people that fall into that category just don't have a framework. And I think that's what's so useful about some of these cases or these case studies is like setting out a framework for managing the subjective, emotional, empathetic parts of nutritional intervention. I think is so important that most people miss it.
Yeah, 100%. I agree with that. Yeah. Sorry, that was a good summary.
Oh yeah, yeah. You know what? It's funny because I know you to be so analytical, but I know you from like a coaching perspective as well, and even in your subjective interpretations of the human side of things, you still found a way, which I really appreciate, because I think I'm analytical on like the nuance of training side of things. You found a way to systematize the subjective, and that's it fits an overall framework of tracking things objectively. But one of the things that you've seemingly been able to track objectively is the subjective experience, which I think is missing in the space. Like there's so many people, like you gave Lane a bit of a shout out earlier. I'm going to kind of, one of his big things is data over feelings. Like, yeah, who doesn't agree to that? People who are paying other people to give them nutritional intervention. Mm-hmm. Right. Well, the data says you're a fat cunt and McDonald's is bad. So I don't care about your feelings. Stop being a fat cunt. Where Phil goes, there's a kangaroo oil petrol station, Servo, down the street or whatever the fuck. Go to that one. It doesn't have a Macca's.
Yeah, I do. I've seen the data, the data over feelings thing, and you're not dealing with robots. That's the thing, is you're dealing with people. And
if you coach people, you deal with people. But if you're in a lab, you deal with robots. But it's the hierarchy of education coming from these talking heads in labs. No shade against Lane, but it's just like, no, if you're in the trenches, you need to care about feelings.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is where I just like to zoom out a lot and say, one of my favorite things I've been saying in the last few months is think outside the box, but don't forget the things outside the box put pressure on things in the box. that's one of the things we need to sort of look at. So when we zoom out, it's all good and go, oh, look past all the data and stuff, but cool. But how is that affecting the data? And this is where, data over feelings. Yeah, that's true, but don't forget the feelings impact the data. Your decisions around certain conversations actually allow your decisions around certain feelings, or your decisions around how you feel about a certain thing, will then lead you to make a decision, which will then change the data. So rather than, why are we trying to fix the data when we can actually zoom out a little bit and maybe affect the feelings, and it'll change the downstream effect. And that's where I think that whole pressure on the box comes from. And we need to sort of remember that as well. And like you said, you outside of a lab, you're dealing with people, and I think that is often forgotten. And you see this a lot even in training. Should you train to failure? Should you not train to failure? But if a person feels like they're going to get more out of a workout, and this goes back to the F45 conversation, so their belief system, for example, they believe, or their perception of norm, that they should be working to a point where they're losing 1.5 liters of fluid in 45 minutes in an F45 or an Orange Theory or whatever the version may be. That's their belief system. So they're going to get more out of it. They're going to attend more. That's sort of how we need to look at these things as a bigger picture, and not just look at, this much protein creates maximum MPS. Okay, cool. But if a person likes to eat 10 more grams, is that going to fucking kill them? Probably not. It's okay.
When it comes to feelings and belief systems and zooming out. Phil Smith. Appreciate it, man. Thank you so much. For those interested, personal coaching from you, nutrition side, super. I think the best way to learn how to coach is to be coached. And even just in your brief conversation with me on like my nutritional habits, and seeing now your process and being like, okay, can you get this like thing? It's kind of like tomato sauce. Can you get that? Send me a picture of it. Can we land at this? Like, are you capable of doing this, you stupid idiot? Spinach. Do you know what spinach is? So like, it's funny to hear this as someone who's been on the other end of it and be like, oh, like it is systematized. It's proceduralized in a way to really dig in on what matters, but then superimposed in that is like, okay, this is why we're going with these ingredients. These are the wins we're going for from like a micro and a macro perspective. So it was really insightful to me to be like, oh, like there's a look under the hood of the machine that is Phil Smith.
Cool. Thank you, Jens.
Appreciate it, man. For those of you looking to reach out to Phil, where's the best place for people to find you?
Probably these days, Insta. Go on Instagram, sport+_performance. Yeah, I really appreciate it. Yeah, that's what I said. Shoot me a DM and we'll go back.
Unreal, man. Thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Always a pleasure, Phil.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.